The year is 1915. Along the banks of the Rouge River in Michigan, something extraordinary is taking shape. Stone by stone, room by room, a palace rises from the earth. But this is not just any mansion. This is the crown jewel of an empire built on control, surveillance, and the radical belief that one man's vision should govern how everyone else lives. Henry Ford changed the world. He gave ordinary families their first automobiles. He revolutionized manufacturing with the assembly line. He paid workers wages that seemed impossible for the time. But there was another side to his story, a darker side that played out behind mansion walls, in company towns, and in the private lives of thousands of workers who discovered that Ford's generosity came with strings attached. Strings that reached into their kitchens, their bedrooms, and their most personal decisions. Today, we're diving deep into the hidden history of Henry Ford's mansion empire, an interconnected web of estates, worker, housing, and entire cities designed not just to showcase wealth, but to reshape human behaviour itself. From the limestone halls of Fairlane to the jungle streets of Fordlândia, this is the story of what happens when unlimited money meets unlimited ambition to control other people's lives. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind America's grand estates and the powerful families who built them, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us uncover these buried histories that shaped the world we live in today. The mansion that would become Ford's primary residence began as an answer to a problem most people would envy. By 1914, Henry Ford was worth more than most small nations. The Model T had made him one of the richest men alive. But wealth at that level creates its own complications. Where do you live when you can afford anything? How do you build a home that matches your vision of how the world should work? Ford's solution was characteristically radical. He would build more than a house. He would build a laboratory for testing his theories about human nature, efficiency, and control. The estate would sprawl across more than 1,000 acres along the Rouge River. It would generate its own electricity from the flowing water. It would be completely self-sufficient, dependent on no one, answerable to no authority except the man who conceived it. But Fairlane was never just about luxury. Every detail reflected Ford's obsession with order and his deep suspicion of chaos. The mansion contained 56 rooms, each serving a specific purpose in a carefully orchestrated system. Hidden passages allowed servants to move through the house without being seen. Service bells connected every room to the staff quarters, ensuring that help arrived instantly when summoned. The powerhouse channeled the river's flow into turbines that fed electricity throughout the property, making Ford independent of outside power companies. The design philosophy was unmistakable. This was a machine for living, built by a man who believed human behaviour could be engineered as precisely as an automobile engine. Ford hated unpredictability. He hated waste. He hated the messiness of lives lived without structure or purpose. At Fairlane, every movement was planned, every schedule optimized, every detail controlled. Clara Ford, Henry's wife, provided a softening influence on the estate's rigid efficiency. She chose furnishings that emphasized comfort over display, colours that soothed rather than impressed. Her touch made the mansion livable rather than merely functional. But even Clara's warmth operated within frameworks she had not designed. The schedules, the expectations, the underlying philosophy of how the household should run belonged entirely to Henry. The staff at Fairlane quickly learned that employment meant more than performing tasks. It meant submitting to a system that governed not just their work hours, but their entire existence on the property. Response times mattered when the service bells rang. Delays were noticed and remembered. The servants' quarters were comfortable by the standards of the time, but comfort came with constant observation. Ford held strong opinions about diet, exercise, and daily routines. These theories shaped what appeared on the family table and influenced the schedules everyone in the house was expected to follow. Meals featured foods Ford believed promoted health and efficiency. Personal preferences ranked below optimization. Even relaxation at Fairlane served productive purposes. Walks doubled as property inspections. Conversations circled back to business matters. This created an atmosphere that visitors described in contradictory terms. Some found the estate peaceful, a welcome escape from industrial Detroit. Others felt watched, measured, quietly evaluated against standards they never fully understood. The beauty of the gardens and the comfort of the rooms coexisted with an invisible pressure, a sense that someone was always keeping score. The domestic staff experienced this most directly. Accounts gathered decades later paint a picture of generosity mixed with unpredictability. Ford could be remarkably kind, remembering birthdays and supporting workers' families during difficult times. But kindness at Fair Lane came without guarantees. A servant who pleased Ford one month might find themselves dismissed the next, over a minor infraction that would have been overlooked elsewhere. The rules were clear until they suddenly changed. Loyalty earned credit, but that credit could evaporate without warning. This pattern of control disguised as care, of structure that promised security but delivered anxiety, would soon extend far beyond the mansion's stone walls. Just a few miles from Fair Lane, another experiment was taking shape. Ford was constructing something unprecedented in American industry, not just a factory but an entire community designed around the needs of his workers. Rows of identical houses lined carefully planned streets. Each home featured running water, indoor plumbing, and modern conveniences most working families had never experienced. These weren't ordinary rental properties. They were instruments of transformation, built on the revolutionary idea that improving workers' living conditions would improve their productivity, their morality, and their loyalty to the company. Ford believed sincerely that better housing would create better people. Better people would build better cars would generate better profits. The logic seemed unassailable. But the Ford housing program came with conditions that revealed the true nature of the gift. Rent was tied directly to employment at Ford Motor Company. Lose your job and you lost your home. There was no separation between workplace performance and domestic security. A single argument with a supervisor could trigger a cascade of consequences that destroyed an entire family's stability. More invasive still was the creation of the Sociological Department, a corporate division whose mission was to monitor how workers lived in their Ford-provided homes. Investigators made regular visits to check for cleanliness, sobriety, and adherence to American middle-class values. They asked about drinking habits, church attendance, and household budgets. They evaluated whether children were attending school regularly and whether wives were managing domestic responsibilities appropriately. The famous $5 day that made Ford a hero to working families across the nation came with strings attached that few outsiders understood. To qualify for the full wage, workers had to pass these domestic inspections. Their homes had to meet company standards. Their lives had to align with Ford's vision of proper American living. For families who had struggled in overcrowded tenements or unsafe boarding houses, the Ford housing represented a dramatic improvement in living conditions. The homes were clean, spacious, and well-maintained. The neighborhoods were safe and orderly. Children could play in yards instead of dodging traffic in crowded city streets. Yet beneath this prosperity ran currents of anxiety that never fully disappeared. Neighbors learned to watch each other, knowing that complaints about noise or untidy lawns could trigger company investigations. Rumors about domestic disputes or financial problems could reach the Sociological Department within days. The streets remained beautiful and the houses well maintained, but residents lived with the constant awareness that their security depended on maintaining appearances and following rules they had no voice in creating. One family's experience illustrates the double-edged nature of Ford's paternalism. Tom and Anna, recent immigrants drawn by the promise of steady work and decent housing, found themselves living better than they had ever imagined possible. Their children attended good schools. Anna had a modern kitchen with running water and a gas stove. Tom's commute to the Rouge plant took minutes instead of hours, but they also discovered that privacy was limited and conditional. When Tom missed several days of work due to illness, investigators appeared at their door within a week. They wanted to verify the sickness, inspect the home's cleanliness, and ensure that Anna was managing the household budget responsibly during the financial strain. The visit felt like support to some extent, but also like surveillance disguised as concern. The tension between genuine improvement and systematic control would define Ford's approach to human management for decades to come. What worked in the mansion and the workers' villages was about to be tested on an unprecedented scale, in a location that would push Ford's theories to their absolute limits. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, 2,500 miles south of Michigan, Henry Ford was about to attempt his most audacious experiment yet. The year was 1928, and Ford had acquired something that staggered even seasoned businessmen: 2.5 million acres of Brazilian jungle, an area larger than Connecticut, purchased with the stroke of a pen and the promise of transforming wilderness into industrial paradise. The motivation was straightforward enough. Ford Motor Company consumed rubber by the ton for tyres, gaskets, and hoses. Nearly all of it came from British and Dutch plantations in Southeast Asia, where prices fluctuated according to foreign politics and distant economic pressures. For a man who had built his empire on self-sufficiency, this dependence felt intolerable. The solution appeared obvious: grow his own rubber where rubber trees originated in the heart of the Amazon basin. But Fordlândia was never just about rubber production. It was Fairlane expanded to the scale of an entire city, a chance to test whether American industrial methods could reshape not just a workforce, but an entire culture. Ford envisioned something unprecedented: a modern American town carved from virgin jungle, complete with hospitals, schools, and neighborhoods that would demonstrate the superiority of American values to indigenous populations. The first boatload of American managers arrived carrying blueprints drafted in Dearborn offices by men who had never seen a rainforest. They laid out streets in perfect grid patterns, exactly like those in Michigan factory towns. They constructed clapboard houses with pitched roofs and front porches, architectural styles designed for temperate climates, and transported wholesale to a tropical environment where they made little practical sense. The water tower that rose above the settlement bore the Ford logo prominently, visible for miles along the Tapajos River. It announced ownership and authority to anyone approaching by boat. Below it, a town began to take shape, according to principles that had worked in Dearborn but had never been tested against the realities of jungle life. American supervisors imposed factory schedules on work that followed natural rhythms. Rubber trees produced best when tapped during cool pre-dawn hours, but Ford's managers insisted on standardized daytime shifts that aligned with assembly line thinking. Local workers who understood the forest's patterns found themselves forced to ignore generations of accumulated wisdom about when and how to harvest rubber effectively. The company cafeteria served oatmeal, white bread, and canned vegetables, foods Ford believed promoted health and efficiency. Traditional Brazilian dishes were discouraged or banned entirely. Workers were expected to adopt not just American labor practices but American lifestyles, eating American meals and organizing their days according to American schedules that often conflicted with local customs and climate realities. Housing assignments reflected hierarchies imported directly from Michigan. American staff lived in larger homes on higher ground with better ventilation and screened windows. Brazilian workers were placed in smaller structures closer to the river, where mosquitoes bred in standing water and tropical diseases spread rapidly through entire neighborhoods. The physical layout of the town communicated a clear message about whose comfort mattered most. Recreation was organized around activities labeled wholesome by company standards. Square dances, poetry readings, and gardening competitions replaced traditional gatherings where workers had once relaxed after exhausting days. Alcohol was strictly prohibited, eliminating cantinas where local communities had historically gathered to socialize and decompress. The clash between imposed order and local reality created tensions that American managers either ignored or misinterpreted. They attributed resistance to laziness rather than recognizing fundamental conflicts between industrial efficiency and tropical agriculture. When productivity targets went unmet, supervisors blamed worker attitudes rather than questioning whether their methods suited the environment. Disease became a constant problem that company doctors struggled to address. Malaria swept through worker housing with devastating regularity. Dengue fever and other tropical illnesses claimed lives faster than medical staff could treat patients. The hospital Ford built became overwhelmed not by industrial accidents, but by preventable diseases that proper planning might have avoided. Meanwhile, the rubber trees themselves began dying in massive numbers. Ford's planners had made a catastrophic error that local agricultural experts had warned against from the beginning. In Southeast Asia, rubber plantations succeeded by spacing trees widely to prevent disease transmission. But in their native Amazon environment, the trees had evolved alongside natural predators and pathogens that could devastate closely planted groves. South American leaf blight, a fungal disease that had always existed in the rainforest, found perfect conditions in Ford's orderly plantations. The fungus leaped from tree to tree through the dense, perfectly aligned rows, turning carefully planned groves into fields of blackened, dying plants. Entire sections of the plantation could be wiped out within a single growing season. The warnings had been clear, but American confidence in industrial methods had overruled local expertise. Engineers who understood steel and assembly lines dismissed advice from people who understood soil, climate, and forest ecology. The result was an agricultural disaster that would have been entirely preventable had Ford's managers listened to the communities they were trying to transform. By 1930, tensions in Fordlândia had reached a breaking point. Workers endured months of foreign food, foreign rules, and foreign supervisors who showed little interest in understanding local conditions or customs. The final insult came when the company cafeteria announced that workers would no longer be served at tables, but would instead line up for food on trays, eating in scheduled shifts like factory workers on an assembly line. For men who had already surrendered their traditional foods, their social gathering places, and their work rhythms to American efficiency, this last change felt like a deliberate humiliation. The line between order and degradation had finally been crossed. The riot began over dinner and exploded into something much larger. Workers overturned tables, smashed windows, and hurled kitchen equipment into the muddy streets. The neat, controlled cafeteria dissolved into chaos as months of suppressed frustration erupted all at once. American managers fled to the river, commandeering boats and watching from the water as the town they had built according to Michigan blueprints burned behind them. Brazilian military forces restored order within hours, but the damage went far beyond broken furniture and shattered glass. The illusion that American systems could transform any environment and any population had been shattered as thoroughly as the cafeteria windows. The workers had demonstrated that they were not raw material waiting to be processed, but people with their own dignity, their own customs, and their own limits on how much control they would tolerate. Ford's response was characteristically stubborn. Instead of reconsidering the fundamental approach, he doubled down on the experiment. A second site called Belterra was established on supposedly better ground, with more favourable conditions. More money flowed south. New machinery arrived by boat. Fresh managers brought renewed optimism and the same blind confidence that had doomed the first attempt. The patterns repeated almost immediately. American methods clashed with tropical realities. Worker resistance met increased surveillance. Disease continued spreading through inadequate housing, and the rubber trees kept dying from blights that proper spacing and local knowledge could have prevented. Through it all, Henry Ford himself never once visited either Fordlândia or Belterra. He directed the entire operation from his office in Dearborn, studying reports and photographs, issuing orders based on information filtered through layers of managers who told him what they believed he wanted to hear. For Ford, the Amazon existed as lines on maps and numbers in ledgers, a problem to be solved through firm application of American principles rather than a living ecosystem with its own logic and requirements. The human cost accumulated in company records that few people ever saw. Hospital admissions rose steadily. Worker turnover reached levels that made consistent production impossible. Families abandoned the settlements as quickly as they could arrange transportation elsewhere. What was supposed to be a showcase of American industrial might became instead a monument to the dangers of imposing rigid systems on complex realities they were never designed to address. Meanwhile, back in Michigan, another generation was coming of age in the shadow of Ford's empire. Children who had grown up in company housing were starting families of their own, and some were beginning to question whether the bargains their parents had made were worth the prices they had paid. The children of Ford's empire were beginning to ask dangerous questions. Questions their parents had learned not to voice aloud during the years when inspectors knocked on doors and employment records determined where families could live. By the 1930s, a generation had grown up knowing that their homes, their neighbourhoods, even their family stability depended on decisions made in distant boardrooms by men they would never meet. Some embraced the system that had lifted their families from poverty to prosperity. Others began to see the invisible chains that came with company paychecks and company housing, and a few started to imagine what life might look like if workers had voices in the decisions that shaped their daily existence. The Great Depression changed everything. As factories across America shuttered and unemployment soared past 25%, Ford's workers found themselves caught in a particularly cruel trap. The same company housing that had once represented security now became a liability. Workers who lost their jobs didn't just lose their income. They lost their homes, their neighbourhoods, their entire social support systems in a single devastating blow. Families who had lived on Ford streets for over a decade suddenly found themselves packing belongings into whatever vehicles they could borrow, searching for relatives or friends who might take them in until they could find work elsewhere. The neat rows of company houses that had symbolized American prosperity now stood partially empty, their windows dark, their yards slowly growing wild as maintenance crews were laid off to cut costs. But the Depression also revealed something Ford's managers had never expected. The communities that had formed within the constraints of company control proved stronger than the systems designed to contain them. Neighbours who had once competed for supervisors' approval began sharing resources and supporting each other through the crisis. Women organised informal networks to distribute food and clothing. Men pulled tools and skills to help families maintain their homes, even when company support disappeared. These acts of mutual aid happened quietly, almost secretly, because they represented something Ford's philosophy had no room for: the possibility that people might organise their own lives more effectively than any corporate system could organise them. The surveillance mechanisms that had once monitored compliance began to break down as staff was reduced, and priorities shifted to basic survival rather than behavioural control. In the mansion itself, the effects of economic collapse were less dramatic but equally telling. Fairlane continued to operate much as it always had, insulated by wealth from the chaos engulfing the wider world. But even Henry Ford could not entirely ignore the contradiction between his estate's continued luxury and the suffering visible just miles away in Detroit's collapsed neighbourhoods. Visitors to Fairlane during these years noted a subtle change in the atmosphere. Conversations at dinner parties grew more guarded. The confident predictions about American industrial supremacy that had once dominated Ford's gatherings gave way to defensive explanations of temporary setbacks and necessary adjustments. The man who had once proclaimed that history was bunk now found his own historical moment slipping beyond his control. Clara Ford responded to the crisis with characteristic grace, quietly increasing her charitable activities and supporting relief efforts in ways that attracted little public attention. But her generosity operated within the same framework that had always governed Fairlane. Help flowed downward from those who had to those who lacked, reinforcing rather than questioning the hierarchies that had created such dramatic inequality in the first place. The powerhouse continued generating electricity from the Rouge River's flow, but even this symbol of self-sufficiency carried new meaning during years when ordinary families struggled to keep their lights on. The mansion's independence from public utilities, once a source of pride, now seemed almost mockingly extravagant to visitors, who knew that thousands of former Ford workers were living without heat or electricity because they could no longer afford basic services. Across the Atlantic, events were unfolding that would soon reshape Ford's empire in ways no amount of planning or control could prevent. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany was being watched with interest by some American industrialists who admired the efficiency of authoritarian systems. Ford himself had expressed sympathy for certain aspects of Nazi organization, seeing parallels between German state control and his own corporate methods. This political alignment would soon create complications that even Ford's wealth and influence could not easily resolve. As war approached, the global systems that had supported his international operations began to fracture. Supply chains that had once moved materials seamlessly between continents now faced disruption from submarine warfare and trade embargoes. But the most profound changes were happening not in boardrooms or on battlefields, but in the daily lives of ordinary people who were discovering their own capacity to resist systems they had never chosen. Labour organisers who had once been dismissed or blacklisted began finding audiences among workers whose faith in corporate paternalism had been shaken by economic catastrophe. The sit-down strikes that would soon paralyse Ford's factories represented more than disputes over wages and working conditions. They embodied a fundamental challenge to the philosophy that had built Fairlane and Fordlândia and the company towns scattered across industrial America. Workers were claiming the right to have voices in decisions that affected their lives, rejecting the notion that efficiency required absolute submission to management authority. Ford's response to this challenge would reveal the true nature of the control he had spent decades perfecting. When persuasion failed and paternalism proved inadequate, the mask of benevolence would slip away to expose something much harder and more threatening beneath. The man who had built an empire on the promise of improving workers' lives was about to demonstrate how far he was willing to go to preserve his power over them. The violence that erupted at the Rouge plant in 1937 shocked even observers familiar with labour disputes. Ford's security forces, led by Harry Bennett, used tactics borrowed from criminal organisations to intimidate and brutalise workers attempting to organise. Photographs of bloodied union organisers being beaten by company thugs appeared in newspapers across the nation, destroying carefully cultivated images of Ford as a benevolent employer. The Battle of the Overpass, as it came to be known, marked a turning point not just in Ford's labour relations but in public perception of corporate power itself. The man who had once been celebrated as a champion of working families now stood exposed as someone willing to use violence to preserve his authority over those same families. The gap between public rhetoric and private reality had become too wide to ignore. At Fair Lane, these events created an atmosphere of siege mentality. Ford became increasingly isolated, surrounded by advisors who told him what they thought he wanted to hear, rather than confronting him with uncomfortable truths about his company's reputation and his workers' grievances. The mansion that had once hosted confident discussions about industrial progress now echoed with defensive planning sessions about how to counter negative publicity and maintain control over an increasingly hostile workforce. The irony was unmistakable. Ford had built his empire on the belief that proper organisation could eliminate conflict and create harmony between management and labour. His houses, his towns, his carefully structured systems were all designed to prove that enlightened corporate control could improve everyone's lives while generating enormous profits. But when that control was challenged, the response revealed its true foundation, not enlightenment, but force. Even as Ford's domestic empire faced these internal contradictions, the international situation was creating new pressures that would soon overwhelm any corporate response. War was coming to Europe and eventually to America itself, bringing with it demands for production that would dwarf anything Ford had previously attempted. The massive industrial capacity that had built his fortune would soon be redirected toward ends that even he could not fully control. The transformation would be swift and total. Factories that had produced automobiles for civilian markets would retool to manufacture aircraft engines and military vehicles. Workers who had lived under company supervision would find themselves classified as essential to national defence, gaining protections and bargaining power that decades of corporate paternalism had failed to provide. The war would accomplish what years of labour organising had struggled to achieve. It would force recognition that workers were partners in production, rather than merely components in an industrial machine. But the changes went deeper than shifting production schedules or new government contracts. The war effort required cooperation between management and labour on a scale that made Ford's old methods of control obsolete. Success demanded innovation, flexibility, and rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. The rigid hierarchies and detailed supervision that had characterized Ford's empire proved inadequate for meeting the complex demands of wartime manufacturing. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs that had previously been reserved for men and demonstrating capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles in industrial organization. African American workers migrated north in massive waves, seeking opportunities in defense plants and bringing with them new demands for equality that could not be satisfied by traditional paternalistic approaches. The social fabric of Ford's carefully controlled communities began to stretch and ultimately tear under these pressures. Company housing designed for stable, traditional families suddenly accommodated single women, diverse ethnic groups, and rapidly changing household compositions that no corporate manual had anticipated. The surveillance systems that had once monitored compliance with middle-class norms became irrelevant when the norms themselves were shifting faster than any bureaucracy could track. At Fair Lane, these changes registered as a gradual but unmistakable loss of relevance. The estate continued to function much as it always had, but the world outside its gates was being transformed by forces that no individual, however wealthy or powerful, could direct or control. Henry Ford remained physically vigorous well into his 70s, but his intellectual and political influence was waning as events moved beyond the scope of his particular vision of American industrial organization. The mansion that had once been a laboratory for testing theories about human behavior now felt increasingly like a museum, preserving approaches to management and social control that history was rapidly making obsolete. Visitors still came, still admired the architecture and the engineering innovations, but they no longer came seeking models for their own operations. The future was being written elsewhere, by people who had learned different lessons from the successes and failures of Ford's empire. The end came quietly for Henry Ford on April 7, 1947. The man who had spent his life controlling every detail died during a power outage at Fairlane, his own hydroelectric system failing him in his final moments. The irony was not lost on those who knew him. The industrialist who had built an empire on self-sufficiency passed away by candlelight when the Rouge River flooded and knocked out his generators. Clara followed him less than 3 years later. With their deaths, the mansion that had hummed with controlled activity for over 3 decades fell into an eerie silence. The Ford Motor Company maintained the property for a time, uncertain what to do with a 56-room estate that nobody wanted to occupy. The house had been designed around one man's specific vision of how life should be organised. Without that organising, intelligence, it became simply too large, too complex, too expensive for anyone else to manage. But Fairlane's decline was just one piece of a larger dissolution. Across Ford's empire, the physical infrastructure began to crumble. The Ford Rotunda, a massive exhibition hall that had welcomed millions of visitors, burned to the ground in 1962 during routine roof repairs. Photographs from that day show smoke rising over Dearborn like a funeral pyre for an entire era. The fire consumed the building in less than an hour, erasing decades of corporate history in minutes. Other landmarks simply vanished through neglect and demolition. Factory buildings were torn down. Worker housing was sold off to individual buyers who modified it beyond recognition. The careful grid of company streets remained, but the houses painted themselves in colours the Sociological Department would never have approved. Gardens grew wild or were replaced with personal preferences that bore no resemblance to company standards. In the Amazon, Fordlândia entered its strangest chapter. The Brazilian government had purchased the entire operation back from Ford in 1945 for a fraction of what it had cost to build. Company executives in Dearborn wrote off the losses and moved on, assuming the jungle would quietly reclaim what remained. But people don't follow corporate logic. The workers who had built their lives in Fordlândia saw no reason to leave simply because distant shareholders had lost interest. The houses still stood. The hospital still functioned, at least basically. The land, however poorly suited for rubber, could grow other crops, so they stayed. The water tower with its Ford logo remained visible from the river, but now it marked a community that belonged to the people who lived there rather than the company that had built it. Decades passed. American machinery rusted in place, too heavy to move, too expensive to repair. Children grew up playing in abandoned warehouses, turning conveyor, belts into balance beams, climbing the same structures their grandparents had helped construct. They learned history not from textbooks, but from the physical evidence that surrounded them daily. A teacher named Lucia now leads lessons through the old plantation roads, pointing out where rubber trees once stood before leaf blight destroyed them. She shows students the managers' houses on the hill, still larger and better ventilated than the worker quarters below. She explains what those differences meant then, and what they suggest now. Her lesson isn't about cultivating resentment, it's about understanding the past without being trapped by it. The Americans arrived with money, confidence, and plans that ignored what local people already knew. They failed. They left. But the town remained. The people who stayed built something new from what had been abandoned, proving that communities could survive the collapse of the systems designed to control them. Back in Michigan, similar. Transformations were unfolding more slowly, but just as definitively. The neighbourhood that had once been Ford's showcase for enlightened worker housing gradually became something its designers never intended. An ordinary community where people knew each other's names, watched each other's children, and argued about parking spaces like neighbours anywhere else. Margaret had lived on one of those streets for over 40 years. Her husband's family had been among the original tenants, arriving in the 1920s when the houses were new and the rules were strict. She remembered stories her mother-in-law told about inspection visits, about careful cleaning before investigators arrived, about rehearsed answers to predictable questions. Those days felt distant now, almost impossible to imagine. Margaret's grandchildren ran through the same rooms where their great-great-grandparents had once whispered, afraid of being overheard. The walls that had witnessed so much careful performance now absorbed the noise of birthday parties, holiday dinners, and arguments that nobody bothered to hide. When historic designation came to protect the neighbourhood from developers, residents had mixed feelings. Some welcomed protection against demolition. Others worried about trading one form of control for another. The compromise emerged through community meetings that stretched late into evenings. Residents would maintain historic character while keeping authority over their own properties. Outside experts could advise but not command. Walking tours now brought visitors through streets that once admitted only employees and their families. The guides, many of them long-time residents, told stories that company brochures had never printed. They spoke about wages that felt miraculous and surveillance that felt suffocating. About gratitude workers genuinely felt and resentment they carefully hid. About the complicated inheritance of living in houses built by people who wanted to control how you lived inside them. Meanwhile, the grandest estate in Ford's empire was undergoing its own transformation. Gawkler Point, the lake house where Edsel and Eleanor Ford had created their own refuge from Henry's demanding vision, faced a choice that would determine its future. Eleanor understood exactly what the property represented and what would happen if she simply left it to heirs who might sell to the highest bidder. The shoreline of Lake St. Clair was valuable real estate. Without protection, the stone house and its grounds would be chopped into lots, the lawns paved over, the art collection scattered through auction houses. In 1976, Eleanor donated the estate to a public trust. The house became a museum. The gardens opened to visitors who would never have passed through the gates while the family lived there. The transformation wasn't simple. Rooms designed for private life now hosted school groups and casual tourists. Staff had to be hired, systems invented, compromises found, between preservation and access. A house built around the comfort and privacy of one family had to be quietly redesigned for thousands of strangers who would flow through it year after year. Some rooms proved too fragile for heavy foot traffic. Others needed careful modifications to accommodate visitors with disabilities. The servants' quarters, modest rooms tucked out of sight, became part of the tour route, making visible the workforce that had made all the elegance function day after day. Jennifer worked as a guide there for over a decade. She remembered her first tour standing in the Great Hall, nervous about explaining lives that seemed impossibly distant from her own. Over time, her approach changed. She moved away from reciting dates and design details toward asking questions. She invited visitors to think about what it meant to live surrounded by such beauty, while knowing exactly where it came from. School groups cut through the reverence that adults brought. Children who had never seen a house so large asked blunt questions their teachers sometimes rushed to soften. Why did they need so many rooms? Where did the workers sleep? Did the kids who lived here have friends from outside the rich neighborhoods? Their curiosity tore away the aura of untouchable grandeur and demanded that the past be treated as human story rather than museum display. Outside, the grounds became community space, in ways Eleanor might not have predicted but would likely have appreciated. Wedding parties posed on terraces where she once hosted diplomats. Families spread blankets on lawns maintained by crews whose work echoed that of earlier gardeners. Summer concerts drew crowds that filled the air with folding chairs and applause, where once there had been only carefully controlled guest lists. The property now served purposes its builders never intended, welcomed people they never would have admitted, and gave space to stories they never wanted highlighted. This transformation, from family sanctuary to public resource, offered one version of what great houses could become. Not mausoleums frozen at a single moment of glory, but living institutions capable of being reinterpreted by each generation. At Fairlane itself, restoration work continued with painful slowness. Scaffolding had covered sections of the limestone façade for years. Funding came in small grants and modest donations, nothing like the vast resources Henry Ford had once commanded. The house that had cost millions to build in 1915 dollars now struggled to find hundreds of thousands for basic maintenance. But the work revealed something Ford never could have provided: honesty about costs, respect for voices he had ignored, willingness to let history remain uncomfortable rather than forcing it into satisfying shapes. Researchers combed through archives, interviewing descendants of former staff, piecing together accounts that had never been gathered into a single telling. The restoration wasn't just about returning the house to its original condition. It was about telling the full story of what had happened inside those walls. Service corridors would be included in tour routes. The stories of workers would stand beside the stories of owners. Fairlane would become not a shrine to one man's vision, but an honest record of how that vision had shaped and been shaped by everyone it touched. This approach demanded resources that standard preservation budgets rarely covered: oral history projects to capture memories before they disappeared, community outreach to find former staff and their families, educational programs designed not to flatter visitors but to invite them into more complicated truths. Similar efforts appeared at other sites, each following its own path. In the old company neighbourhoods, long-time residents began building their own archives. They recorded conversations with elderly neighbours who still remembered inspections and rent policies. They photographed original details before renovations erased them. They gathered documents and stories that no official institution had ever bothered to collect. These projects operated mostly without institutional backing. No major foundation grants, no glossy brochures. Just people who understood that their histories mattered even if nobody had ever written them down. The work continues today, unfinished and underfunded but stubbornly alive. Every stone reset at Fair Lane, every recorded memory from the neighbourhoods, every photograph rescued from family albums amounts to a small act of reclamation. The buildings now belong less to the man who commissioned them and more to the people willing to care for them and tell the full story of what happened inside their walls. It's a slow process, this transfer of ownership from the powerful to the persistent. But it's happening, one carefully preserved document at a time, one honestly told story at a time, one visitor at a time who leaves understanding that the past was more complicated than they had imagined. The empire Henry Ford built was designed to last forever. The factories would outlive their workers, the houses would outlive their tenants, the systems of control would perpetuate themselves even as individual names changed. But empires built on control carry the seeds of their own dissolution. They depend too heavily on the vision of their creators. They leave too little room for the people they're supposed to serve to shape their own lives. What remains now are fragments being slowly reassembled by people who never lived under Ford's direct authority, but inherit the consequences of his choices. They're writing new stories in old buildings, asking different questions about the same evidence, refusing to let the complexity of the past be simplified into comfortable myths about American progress or industrial genius. The Mansion Empire is passing from the hands that built it into the hands of those who will carry it forward. What they make of it, and what they choose to remember, remains to be written in restoration workshops and community meetings, in classrooms where children ask uncomfortable questions and archives, where researchers piece together forgotten lives. The brass doorknob at Fair Lane's main entrance has been turned perhaps 1,000,000 times, by hands in white gloves during formal dinners, by calloused palms of workers delivering supplies, by fingers trembling with nerves before important meetings. The metal has worn smooth in places, shaped by decades of arrivals and departures, by all the hopes and fears that have passed through that threshold. This morning, a guide polishes that knob before the first tour. Nobody has told her she must. There's no checklist requiring it. She does it because the gesture connects her to everyone who has touched that same surface before. The door remembers none of this and all of it. Objects absorb history without understanding it. They persist while the people who use them disappear. In a few minutes, the first visitors will arrive. Families, students, historians, curious strangers. Each will touch this same metal. Each will cross this same threshold. Each will take away a different sense of what this house is and what it means. The door swings open. Morning light spills across the entrance hall. Another day begins at Fair Lane, and the story shifts again, ever so slightly, with everyone who enters and everyone who leaves. The questions echo through every corner of what remains. A child stands in Fair Lane's Great Hall, neck craned back, trying to make sense of the ceiling that soars impossibly high above her head. Her classmates have scattered through the room, running fingers along carved woodwork, counting patterns in the marble floors, whispering about the size of everything around them. She stays planted in one spot, eyes wide, overwhelmed by space so far removed from her everyday life that her mind reaches for explanations and finds only more mysteries. How big does a house need to be? The question arrives unbidden, pulled from her by rooms that stretch beyond any practical purpose she can imagine. Her teacher notices and walks over, crouching down to the child's eye level. "What are you thinking about?" The girl makes a vague gesture toward the walls, the ceiling, the sheer volume of air contained within stone boundaries. Why did they need all this space? That simple question reverberates through every structure in Ford's crumbling empire. the 56 rooms at Fair Lane, the stone mansion overlooking Lake St. Clair, the rows of identical workers' houses laid out with military precision, the entire American town carved from Amazon jungle and left to slowly decay. Each building represents an answer to hidden questions about how human life should be organized, how power should be distributed, how ordinary people should relate to those who employ them. The answers weren't simple then, and they're not comfortable now. Henry Ford genuinely believed in improvement. He saw his vision of order as progress rather than oppression. The wages at his plants changed families' lives in measurable ways. Company houses offered running water, heat, and indoor plumbing to people who had never experienced such luxuries. Hospitals and schools in Fordlândia treated real illnesses and educated real children, regardless of their other purposes. But good intentions don't erase consequences. The Sociological Department's home inspections still invaded private lives, no matter how many generous paychecks accompanied them. The threat of eviction still hung over company housing like a perpetual storm cloud. One workplace dispute, one negative evaluation, and families could lose everything they had built. The enforcement of American customs on Brazilian workers still carried the unmistakable message that some cultures mattered while others needed correction. Ford's empire was never simply good or evil. It existed in the complicated space between those extremes, delivering genuine benefits wrapped in systems of control that slowly tightened around the people they were supposed to help. The buildings contain evidence supporting every possible interpretation: beauty and coercion, generosity and surveillance, comfort and anxiety. The archives hold documents pointing in completely opposite directions. Descendants of both workers and owners carry memories that refuse to flatten into neat moral summaries. What endures is not a final judgment, but an ongoing invitation. The places still exist, though many bear scars of neglect and time. The records can still be read, though they require patient work to decode their full meanings. New stories keep emerging as different researchers ask questions their predecessors never thought to pose. Anyone willing to invest the effort can visit these sites, examine the evidence, listen to competing narratives, and reach their own conclusions about what Ford built and what it cost the people who had to live within his designs. The child in Fairlane's Great Hall won't resolve any of these tensions today. She'll drift back to her group, see more rooms, absorb more dates and architectural details, eventually board a bus that will carry her back to her own modest house on an ordinary street. But something has taken root in her thoughts, a tiny shift in how she perceives space and authority, a growing awareness that buildings aren't neutral, that the rooms people construct reveal what they believe about themselves and everyone else, that architecture always expresses opinions about how the world should work. Perhaps she'll return someday, older and armed with sharper questions and a researcher's notebook. Perhaps she'll join the preservationists, filmmakers, or community historians who carry these stories forward into an uncertain future. Perhaps she'll simply remember this moment of overwhelming scale and strangeness, the first flicker of doubt about how society organizes itself and who benefits from those arrangements. The Mansion Empire asks questions without providing final answers. Each generation responds according to its own values, its own anxieties, its own understanding of what human beings owe one another. The systems Ford created have mostly dissolved, but the underlying tensions persist. The desire to improve people's lives competes with the urge to control how they live those lives. The promise of security battles against the reality of dependence. The appeal of efficiency clashes with the messiness of actual human communities. These are not historical curiosities. They're living issues that surface wherever employers provide housing, wherever companies monitor workers' personal behavior, wherever powerful institutions promise to solve social problems through better organization and stricter oversight. Ford's experiments failed, but the impulses that drove them didn't disappear. They evolved, adapted, found new forms and new justifications. The mansion stands as a monument to both achievement and hubris, a reminder that the grandest visions can produce the most troubling consequences. The stone walls will outlast everyone who built them and everyone who visits them. But the meanings attached to those walls keep shifting, shaped by whoever has the patience to look closely and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions about power, control, and the price of progress. The child looks up one final time at the impossible ceiling, then runs to catch up with her classmates. Behind her, the Great Hall settles back into its echoing silence. waiting for the next person who will stand in that same spot, crane their neck toward the carved stonework, and wonder why anyone needed so much space to call home. The brass doorknob turns beneath another hand. Another visitor crosses the threshold. The story continues, one person at a time, one question at a time, one uncomfortable truth at a time. The empire is gone, but its lessons remain, embedded in stone and memory, waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to look. Henry Ford's mansion empire rose from ambition and crumbled into memory, but the questions it raised about power, control, and human dignity echo through every corporate campus, planned community, and workplace that promises to improve lives while dictating how those lives should be lived. The limestone walls of Fairlane still stand, no longer housing a man who believed he could engineer perfect societies. The workers' houses in Dearborn shelter families who paint their doors whatever colours they choose. In the Amazon, children play beneath a rusted water tower that bears the faded logo of a company that abandoned them decades ago. These buildings have outlasted their creator's vision, transformed by people who refuse to let someone else's blueprint define their futures. What Ford built was magnificent and monstrous, generous and controlling, visionary and blind. His story reminds us that the most dangerous power isn't the kind that announces itself with violence, but the kind that wraps itself in good intentions and promises to make everything better if we'll just surrender the right to make our own choices. The brass doorknob at Fairlane's entrance keeps turning beneath new hands. Each visitor who crosses that threshold carries away different lessons about wealth, work, and the hidden costs of progress. Some see inspiration in Ford's innovations. Others see warning in his overreach. The wisest see both, understanding that human achievements are never as simple as their monuments suggest. The empire is gone, but its ghosts remain, haunting every boardroom where executives debate how much control they should exercise over employees' lives, every community meeting where residents argue about who gets to decide how neighbourhoods should develop, every moment when power promises improvement in exchange for submission. The child who stood amazed in Fairlane's Great Hall will inherit a world still grappling with these questions. Her generation will decide whether to repeat Ford's mistakes or learn from them, whether to build new forms of control or find better ways to balance individual freedom with collective prosperity. The choice, as always, belongs to those willing to ask the hardest questions and live with the most uncomfortable answers.